You saw a black woman in business class and assumed I didn't belong, without even bothering to check my ticket. The soft cabin lights cast a warm glow over the interior of Flight 287 from Ridgeway to Los Angeles. The usual sounds of a pre-departure routine filled the air. Flight attendants greeting passengers, the rustling of luggage, and quiet conversations. Maya Sinclair, dressed simply in jeans and a navy blue blouse, moved through the aisle toward her business class seat for A. A well-worn leather tote bag hung over her shoulder, the only piece of luggage she carried. Unlike many of the other passengers in the section, she had no designer suit, no flashy jewelry, no air of self-importance. She was just another traveler, exactly how she liked it. As she reached her row, she set her bag down and adjusted her seatbelt. That's when Margaret Wilkins appeared. "Excuse me, ma'am." Margaret's voice was clipped professional, but laced with impatience. "This section is reserved for business class passengers." Maya looked up, surprised. "I know," she said simply, offering a polite smile. Margaret's eyes flicked over Maya's understated clothes, then to her small tote bag. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Something about this woman didn't sit right with her. "I think there's been a mistake," Margaret continued. "Business class is only for passengers who have purchased premium seats." Maya's brow furrowed. "There's no mistake," she replied, her voice calm. "This is my seat. 4A. Margaret hesitated for a fraction of a second, but her training, her years of enforcing order, took over. "I understand," she said, forcing a tight smile. "But we have strict policies regarding seat assignments. If you could please move to your assigned section." "This is my assigned section." Maya's voice remained firm, controlled. She reached into her tote and pulled out her boarding pass, holding it up for Margaret to see. Margaret barely glanced at the ticket. Instead of backing down, her expression hardened. "There must be a mix-up at check-in," she said, shaking her head. "Maybe they overbooked the cabin." Maya exhaled slowly. She had been in far too many high-stakes meetings, negotiated million-dollar deals, and led an entire airline company. She wasn't about to let one flight attendant push her around. "I assure you there's no mix-up," she said, holding Margaret's gaze. "Could you please check your system?" Margaret hesitated again, her posture stiff. Other passengers were watching now, some with mild curiosity, others with silent judgment. A well-dressed man in a tailored suit across the aisle chuckled under his breath. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, shaking his head. "People always trying to get something for free." Maya heard him. She ignored it. But Margaret didn't. That comment only confirmed what she already believed about Maya. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, her voice firmer now. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to economy." A moment of silence stretched between them. Maya held Margaret's gaze, and for the first time, a flicker of something crossed Margaret's face. Was it doubt? Then Maya did something unexpected. She exhaled slowly, then stood up. No arguing. No fighting. No dramatic scene. Just quiet, calm acceptance. Passengers from economy craned their necks, some whispering, some smirking, as Maya reached for her bag. Margaret felt a small pang of unease. But she quickly buried it. She had done her job. As Maya turned toward the back of the plane, a flight attendant from the economy section appeared. "Ma'am, do you need assistance?" she asked kindly, unaware of what had just happened. Maya shook her head, forcing a small smile. "No, thank you. I'll find my seat." She walked through the narrow aisle, past rows of passengers who either ignored her or looked at her with quiet amusement. A middle-aged woman with pearl earrings and a designer handbag leaned toward her husband and murmured, "Well, that was embarrassing." A young man in his 20s, wearing noise-canceling headphones, glanced up at Maya, his eyes flicking over her outfit before going back to scrolling on his phone. That IT was a subtle kind of humiliation, not loud, not overt, but it was there, lingering in the air like a quiet, unspoken judgment. Maya finally reached her new seat, 22B, squeezed between two other passengers. She sat down, fastened her seatbelt, and rested her hands on her lap. She could feel Margaret's eyes on her from the front of the plane, but she didn't look back. Instead, she gazed out the window, watching as the last bit of daylight faded into the horizon. This wasn't the first time someone had judged her for how she looked rather than who she was. And it wouldn't be the last. But soon Margaret Wilkins would realize the full weight of her mistake, and it would be a lesson she'd never forget. The plane cruised at 35,000 feet, steady in the air. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere was anything but smooth. Maya sat silently in her cramped economy seat, angled slightly toward the window. She wasn't upset. She had dealt with far worse in her career. But there was something about the quiet judgment in people's eyes that left a bitter taste. Across the aisle, a flight attendant named Rachel Harper approached her with a warm smile. "Can I get you anything, ma'am?" she asked, her tone genuinely kind. A stark contrast to Margaret's earlier treatment. Maya glanced at her name tag. She appreciated the sincerity, but simply shook her head. "I'm fine, thank you," she said, offering a small, polite smile. Rachel nodded and moved on. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Margaret stood near the galley, distracted. Her mind kept drifting back to Maya. Why had she moved so easily? Why hadn't she argued? Most passengers who got bumped to economy caused a scene. They yelled. They demanded to speak to a supervisor. But Maya? Nothing. She had just accepted it. Something about that didn't sit right with Margaret. As she adjusted the settings on the coffee machine, her fellow flight attendant, Michael Reed, leaned against the counter beside her. "What's with you?" he asked, arching an eyebrow. "You look like you just committed a crime." Margaret exhaled sharply. "That woman I moved to economy, something about her is off." Michael took a sip from his water bottle. "What do you mean?" "I mean she didn't even fight me on it," Margaret said, crossing her arms. "She just went." Michael chuckled. "Well, maybe she knew she was in the wrong." Margaret wanted to agree. But deep down, a small, nagging doubt had started to form. She brushed it off. Mistakes happened all the time. Still, her discomfort lingered. And soon, she'd understand exactly why. "Excuse me." Margaret Wilkins set her cup down, studying Maya Sinclair carefully, not as a flight attendant, but as a person. "How long have you been a flight attendant?" Maya hesitated. 8 years. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "That's a long time. You must have seen a lot." Maya wasn't sure where this was going. "I suppose." Margaret gave a small, knowing smile. "It's a tough job. I know that." A flicker of confusion crossed Maya's face. "Oh, and how would you know?" Margaret simply smiled. "Just a feeling." Then, without another word, she stepped back, leaving Maya standing there, confused and strangely unsettled. For the rest of the flight, Maya couldn't shake the interaction. There was something about Margaret that felt different as the plane began its descent into Ridgeway. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Michael Reed. On behalf of Ridgeway Airlines, we'd like to thank you for flying with us today. And a special thanks to Miss Margaret Wilkins, who is on board with us tonight. We're always honored to have her fly with us." A hush fell over the cabin. Passengers turned, whispering among themselves. Maya, still securing the first-class cabin for landing, went completely still. Her mind raced. No way. Slowly, as if in a trance, Maya turned toward economy class. Margaret was already looking at her, expression unreadable. Then, like a punch to the gut, it hit her. She had just kicked her CEO out of business class. A cold sweat broke out across Maya's back. Her face burned as the weight of her mistake came crashing down. The man who had smirked earlier, his face had gone pale. Other passengers exchanged looks, some sneaking glances at Maya, clearly piecing it together. Her hands felt clammy. Her pulse pounded. She had humiliated the most powerful person in the company, and Margaret had let her. No yelling, no dramatic reveal, just calm, patient silence. And now, Maya would have to face the consequences. Los Angeles International Airport, 11:47 p.m. The moment the plane touched down, Maya felt like her world had crashed along with it. She went through the landing procedures on autopilot, her mind spinning with one relentless thought. "I just humiliated my CEO in front of an entire flight." As passengers stretched and gathered their belongings, Maya barely noticed. She kept stealing glances toward economy class, where Margaret sat calmly, waiting for her turn to disembark. Every nerve in Maya's body screamed at her to fix this. But how? Apologize? Beg for forgiveness? Would Margaret even listen? Her pulse thundered in her ears as she watched Margaret rise, grab her tote bag, and move gracefully through the aisle. This is my chance. Taking a deep breath, Maya rushed toward the exit, planting herself near the door. Passengers passed by, one by one. Then, finally, Margaret Wilkins. Maya's heart pounded. Miss Wilkins, Margaret met her eyes with a polite yet distant smile. No need, Miss Sinclair, she said smoothly. Then, she stepped past Maya and walked off the plane that no anger. No reprimand, just quiet, professional dismissal, and somehow that was worse that IT was like Maya had already been erased. Like she was nothing. For the first time in her career, she felt utterly powerless. The email that changed everything to be why the time Maya reached her hotel, she hadn't even taken off her uniform when her phone buzzed. New email, corporate office, mandatory meeting. Her stomach dropped. With shaky hands, she clicked on it. To Maya Sinclair. From Ridgeway Airlines corporate office. Subject, mandatory meeting, Los Angeles HQ. Dear Miss Sinclair, you are required to attend a meeting at Ridgeway Airlines headquarters, Los Angeles, tomorrow at 9 a.m. sharp. Failure to attend will result in disciplinary action. That was IT.no explanation. No details. But Maya didn't need them. She already knew. 9 a.m. Ridgeway Airlines headquarters. Walking into the sleek, glass-walled corporate building, Maya felt completely out of place. She had been flying for 8 years, but had never stepped foot in this part of the company. Her hands clenched at her sides as she approached the front desk. Name, the receptionist asked, barely looking up. Maya Sinclair. The receptionist typed something, then nodded. Conference room 4B. Third floor. Maya's stomach twisted. She stepped into the elevator, each passing floor feeling like a countdown to her fate. Then, finally, she was there. Inside the sleek, modern conference room stood Margaret Wilkins, calm, composed, untouchable. And Maya had never felt smaller. She forced herself to step inside. Miss Sinclair, Margaret greeted, gesturing toward the seat across from her. Maya sat carefully, as if the chair might break beneath her. Silence filled the room. Margaret studied her, not angry, not smug, just studying. Then, finally, she spoke. So, she said, leaning back slightly, tell me what went wrong yesterday. Maya's throat was dry as sandpaper. She swallowed hard. I made a mistake. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Which was? Maya hated this. Hated having to say it out loud. But she forced herself to. I judged a passenger based on their appearance, she admitted. I didn't check the ticket. I assumed you didn't belong in business class. Margaret nodded, waiting. And I was wrong, Maya whispered. A beat of silence. Then, Margaret tilted her head slightly. Why do you think you did that? Maya hesitated. No one had ever asked her that before. I think, she said carefully, I've been trained to see certain passengers a certain way. We're told to enhance the experience for premium travelers, to be more attentive to them. Margaret's gaze sharpened. She was listening closely. And people who don't fit that image? Maya exhaled. They get overlooked. Or worse. Margaret studied her for a moment. Then, she nodded slowly. That's what I thought. A long silence. Then, unexpectedly, Margaret smiled. Not smug. Not cruel. Just knowing. Miss Sinclair, she said, folding her hands on the table. I was a flight attendant before I became CEO. Maya's eyes widened. What? Margaret's smile grew. I know what it's like to be in your position. To work long hours, to deal with difficult passengers, to feel like you have to prove yourself every single day. Maya's heart pounded. But, Margaret said, her tone turning serious, I also know what it's like to be judged unfairly. To be underestimated. A pause. Then, Margaret leaned forward slightly. So tell me, Miss Sinclair, what did you learn from all this? Maya hesitated. Then, for the first time since the flight, she finally understood. That I need to see people for who they are, she said. Not what they look like. Margaret held her gaze. Then, slowly, she nodded. Good, she said. Because that's something this entire company needs to learn. Maya blinked. What do you mean? Margaret smiled. I'm not firing you, she said. I'm promoting you. Margaret forced a chuckle at Eleanor's words. Thanks, though I think promotion is a generous way to describe corporate punishment. Eleanor tilted her head. Is it? Because from what I hear, you're being given a real chance to make a difference. Margaret swallowed. Was she? Right now, she felt like a fraud. She had spent years enforcing the very biases that had landed her in trouble. And now she was supposed to be the one fixing them? What if she wasn't the right person for this job? Eleanor seemed to sense her doubt. She pulled up a chair and sat down across from Margaret. Let me ask you something, she said. If you could go back to that flight, back to the moment before you spoke to Maya, what would you do differently? Margaret hesitated. I would have checked her ticket first, she admitted. Eleanor nodded. And if her ticket had still surprised you? Margaret exhaled. I would have treated her the same as anyone else. Then start there, Eleanor said simply. Margaret blinked. What? Eleanor gestured toward the notepad sitting untouched on Margaret's desk. You don't have to rewrite the entire airline policy overnight. Start with what you know, the small things. Teach people to do better in the moments that matter. Margaret stared at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen. Eleanor was right. She couldn't undo the past, but she could change what happened next. Margaret's first real test 2 weeks later. Margaret stepped onto a plane for the first time in her new role. This time, she wasn't wearing a flight attendant's uniform. She was there to observe as she walked down the aisle. She noticed an older woman, likely in her mid-60s, struggling to lift her carry-on bag into the overhead bin. She was dressed simply but neatly. The young flight attendant, no older than 25, stood nearby, watching but not offering to help. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. She recognized that hesitation, that was the same hesitation she had felt when she saw Maya that day. The flight attendant wasn't being outright rude, but he had already made a decision about this woman, decided she wasn't premium enough to warrant extra attention. Margaret took a deep breath and stepped forward. Excuse me, she said gently. Can you give her a hand with that? The young flight attendant blinked, caught off guard. Oh, of course. He quickly lifted the woman's bag into the bin, flashing Margaret an uncertain smile before stepping back. The older woman smiled warmly. Thank you, dear. Margaret nodded, but her focus stayed on the young crew member. Because she knew that moment had just taught him something. Maybe he didn't even realize it yet, but it had. Just like that moment had changed her. But as she took her seat in the observation row, Margaret felt something settle inside her. She was exactly where she needed to be. And this time, she wasn't going to waste it. 6 months later, Ridgeway Airlines headquarters. The conference room at Ridgeway Airlines HQ was packed with flight attendants, training staff, and corporate executives. At the front of the room, Margaret stood behind a podium, her hands resting firmly on the surface. She wasn't nervous, not anymore. She scanned the room, taking in all the faces looking back at her. Some were skeptical, some were curious, and some reminded her of herself. A version of herself before. She took a deep breath. This company gave me a second chance, she started. And I don't take that lightly. She paused, letting that sink in. 6 months ago, I was in your position. I was a senior flight attendant. I thought I knew how to do my job. She let her gaze drift over the room. And then I made the worst mistake of my career. A few people shifted in their seats. I judged a passenger based on her appearance. I assumed that, because of how she looked, she didn't belong in business class. I didn't check her ticket. I didn't listen. I let my assumptions control my actions. A heavy silence settled in the room. And that passenger? Margaret continued. She wasn't just any traveler. She was Maya Sinclair, our CEO. A few people exhaled sharply. Others widened their eyes. Even now, the story still hit hard. She could have fired me, Margaret said simply. But she didn't. Instead, she gave me an opportunity to change, to be better, and that's why I'm standing here today. She gestured toward the presentation screen behind her. Displayed in bold letters were the words, Beyond First Impressions, Ridgeway's new passenger experience training. This is the program we've built, Margaret said. A program designed to make sure that what happened to me, what happened to her, never happens again. She let the words settle. We are here to create an airline that treats every passenger with respect. Regardless of what they wear, what they carry, or how they look, we're here to make sure that no one gets overlooked. She took a breath. This isn't just about changing policies, it's about changing mindsets. Silence, and then a single clap, then another, and then the entire room erupted into applause. Margaret felt her chest tighten, not with nerves, with pride. For the first time, she wasn't just fixing a mistake, she was leading a change. After the session ended, Margaret stayed behind in the conference room, collecting her notes. A familiar voice spoke from the doorway. "You did well." She looked up. Maya Sinclair stood there, arms crossed, a small smile playing on her lips. Margaret straightened. "I hope so." Maya stepped inside, studying her carefully. "You've come a long way," she said. 6 months ago, you were afraid to even admit you were wrong. Now, you're leading a corporate-wide training initiative." Margaret let out a small breath. "Honestly," she admitted, "at first, I wasn't sure I deserved this job." Maya nodded, unsurprised. "And now?" she asked. Margaret met her gaze. Now she smiled. "Now I'm sure I do." Maya's smile widened slightly. "That's what I wanted to hear." She extended a hand. Margaret hesitated for only a second before shaking it firmly, and no longer as a flight attendant facing her boss, but as two women who understood each other did. A few weeks later, Margaret was on a routine flight observation when she noticed something that made her pause. That a young woman, dressed simply, carrying only a tote bag, stood at the entrance to the business class cabin. She looked around uncertainly, as if expecting someone to tell her she was in the wrong place. And then, one of the flight attendants approached her. That a young man, the same crew member Margaret had corrected months ago. That he smiled at the woman. "Welcome aboard, ma'am," he said warmly. "Can I help you find your seat?" Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat, because in that moment, she realized this is what change looks like. She didn't have to correct him this time. That he already knew. And that meant she had done something that mattered.